though, with you, Jordan Peterson. Your book emerges originally from a question on Quora, a website which sort of crowdsourced wisdom. And it was an answer to the question, what are the most valuable things everyone should know? And you've distilled that down to 12 rules. They're very folksy. They're very direct. The chapter titles are things like stand up straight with your shoulders back, set your house in perfect order before you criticise the world, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. I wondered if you had to distill that further, what's the absolute core of the book? What's the last rule that would go if you had a really exigent editor?
I would say it would be a rule that isn't particularly expressed as a rule. It would be a summary of the rules, which is take responsibility for everything that you can. That's the fundamental message of the book. And it's because the things that you can take responsibility for are things that you can actually control. And
one of the corollaries of that is that you don't blame the world for things that have gone wrong in your life. You don't look outwards and say, it is, for example, the patriarchy, which you don't believe exists.
Well, it's better to do everything you can to sort things out at a personal level so that you can be in a position to do a clear-headed analysis of what might be wrong that isn't your doing. And it's a more hopeful stance as well, because it leaves things in your control. And the degree to which you can alter your destiny at least by ceasing to do things that you know to be untrue and wrong, is an open question. And I think people have far more control in that regard than any of us really realize.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the consequences of that and what follows from that. Louise O'Neill, you've just published this new version of The Little Mermaid, and you clearly have the notion that there are things wrong with society that need fixing. That, as it were, it doesn't always start with the individual, that the individual is sometimes the victim of forces.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't see myself as a victim, and I would agree with Jordan that I think that people need to take personal responsibility. But I also think that it's a little bit short-sighted to say that the world is equal or that the patriarchy doesn't exist. I mean, for me as a woman, just living in the world, it's very obvious to me that the patriarchy exists. If you look at how disproportionately things like domestic violence and rape violence affect women. The dismally low rape conviction rates in Europe, but let's say Ireland is the lowest in Europe, which is why I suppose it's particularly resonant for me. Street harassment, the gender pay gap. I mean, I could go on, but these are, things that are very tangible and easy to prove.
And going for a story like The Little Mermaid, are those instruments of that oppression?
Yes. Yeah, well, fairy tales are, I think...
That's why you're taking it on.
Yeah, I think they're really interesting from a feminist perspective because, they were originally written by women and dealing with subjects that, primarily affected women of that time. But I suppose they are quite problematic in that the messaging contained within is very didactic and especially contains messages around purity and beauty for women. And when I was asked to rewrite The Little Mermaid from a feminist perspective, I mean, this is a story about a young woman who literally silences herself. She gives up her voice, she sacrifices her home, she sacrifices her family, she mutilates her body in order that a man that she barely knows will find her attractive. So...
Okay. Well,
there was a lot in it.
We'll come back to that a little later. Hashi Mohammed, you haven't given up your voice, but you have changed it very significantly. You came from Kenya when you were 9 years old. You spoke very little English. Yes. You were a refugee. You now work as a barrister in a prestigious London chambers. That is a kind of fairy tale story in some respects, isn't it?
Yes, well, I mean, that's what I've been writing about a great deal, and the book that, for example, Jordan is talking about in terms of individual responsibility is something that I grew up with. I remember my grandmother, as you say, I came here as a 9-year-old refugee without my parents. My father had died when I was 9. My mother gave birth to 12 children. And so you can imagine the kind of cards that life deals you. But my grandmother always used to say that you weren't going to be any use to anybody else until you did something for yourself first. And so this message of individual responsibility very much resonates. But where I depart from Jordan's analysis is this idea that I go into a neutral world in which I can do everything I can, and somehow everything else will be fine. But the core message of focusing on yourself, understanding your context before you can attack the world, is something that very much resonates with me and others, and not just the kind of caricature that's been given of Jordan's of angry white men or the kind of other caricatures that we've heard. But there are other disagreements which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment.
I'm sure we will. Lawrence Wright, you've written a book about Texas, your home state. In part, you're tackling the myths of that state, aren't you?
Right.
The ways in which the myths of that state are useful, and fruitful, and the ways in which they're damaging.
Yeah, it's a state with a brand that universally everybody recognizes Texas as something, whether it's problematic or enviable, but it is. I remember when I was a young man teaching in Cairo, and I used to go horseback riding out at the pyramids, and I'm a city boy, but they found out I was from Texas, and they started calling me Texas. And then one day they said, "Oh, Texas, we've got a horse for you." And two men brought out this rearing stallion with his nostrils. It was terrifying. And
you survived,
but being Texas, I had to ride this stallion, and he took me halfway to Libya. But I felt I was literally astride the Texas myth.
Being Texas, did you get off the horse and feel an inner kernel of pride that what had not killed you had made you stronger?
Yeah, that plus soreness, yeah.
Jordan Peterson, coming back to you. The book you've written is very much about, it begins with this notion of balance between order and chaos. I mean, you draw on Tao and the ideas of yin and yang. The subtitle of your book, though, is and what's important there is balance between those two things. But the subtitle of your book is An Antidote to Chaos, not the middle way between order and chaos, an antidote to chaos. Why an antidote to chaos rather than the middle way?
Well, I think the middle way is the important way, but I think at the moment that our culture is suffering from an excess of chaos. We have a moral relativism as a fundamental ethos. We're detached from our underlying religious metaphors and stories. People in universities in particular, I see this, are in crisis in relationship to their culture and their vision and destiny, especially among men, although certainly not exclusively. And we've emphasized individual rights rather than responsibilities in the West for like 3 generations. And so I think there's a tremendous imbalance at the moment, and I was trying to rectify that in part.
One of the reasons when you give talks that you get protesters attending as well as adoring fans is, I think, that you've gendered order and chaos.
Well, I haven't.
Well, you haven't. You say you haven't. You say you've inherited a gendering. Why should they be gendered at all?
Well, because our fundamental cognitive axioms are social cognitive. We see the world as a gendered place. We see the world through a social lens. I mean, we evolved in a social environment, and so our deepest intuitions are to interpret the world as a set of characters, and those characters come gendered. And generally speaking, Mother Nature is a representative of chaos because she's destructive but also plenipotential, I would say, and order is patriarchal, which everyone uses that metaphor.
I thought you didn't believe in the patriarchy.
I don't.
So why I'm slightly puzzled as to how you can have a distillation of gender in one sense as a social inheritance, but not.
Well, the word patriarchy in our culture has become synonymous with arbitrary tyranny and oppression, and I don't regard our culture as arbitrarily tyrannical or oppressive. And I don't believe the narrative that pits women against men or men against women as the core narrative of our culture. I think that's absurd.
Well, I want to pick up that word arbitrary because you talk also about consciousness as being masculine. You have a moment in your book where you say Neumann and Jung, who is very important to you, say that consciousness was masculine.
Symbolically masculine.
It seemed almost comically transparent to me that they decide what gender are we going to apply to consciousness? Well, we're men. It probably looks like us. You write this as well. It is certain that a woman needs consciousness to be rescued, and as noted above, consciousness is symbolically masculine and has been since the beginning of time. But consciousness is an intellectual concept. It doesn't have a gender.
What makes you think it's an intellectual concept? Consciousness isn't an intellectual concept. Well, it's a phenomenon.
It's a thing in the world, but women...
Yes, so our conceptualization of it is an intellectual construct.
In what sense is it masculine?
It's masculine symbolically, and
the
radical investigations of... Well, that's a core element of fundamental mythology. It's been a principle of metaphorical cognition for forever. It's not an arbitrary decision by any stretch of the imagination.
It is an inherited decision, but I'm curious again about the way in which you treat some cultural inheritance. As you write this as well, we've learned to live together and to organise our complex society slowly and incrementally over vast stretches of time, and we do not understand with sufficient exactitude why what we are doing works. it seems to me that begs a very large question, which is, works for whom? A lot of people think that it doesn't work. That's why social change comes about. That's why societies and civilizations alter over time. So, works for whom?
Well, it might be better to ask, works compared to what? So there's a handful of societies in the world, perhaps 30 or 40, that are functioning at a pretty high level. Those are the countries that everyone wants to immigrate to. And there's inequality within those cultures, but you can't lay that at the feet of those cultures. Inequality is a much deeper problem than anything you can lay at the feet of an economic or political system. And so works, in my estimation, is works by historical standards, including the standards of the last 150 years.
I just want to put one thought experiment first,
Sure.
and then I will bring you in. 120 years. I assume you agree with female suffrage, that
Sure.
women should have a vote. Well, 120 years
It's a good
ago,
assumption.
120
Fair
years
enough.
ago, I felt I had to check. 120 years ago, that would have been a radical and disruptive idea to have. People would have advanced exactly the arguments you advance about inherited social traditions, about the way things have been done. Scientists would have advanced information. A phrenologist would have come along, I don't doubt, and said, well, you know, women's bump of electoral selection is smaller than men. What?
They would have advanced any of the arguments
they would.
No, they wouldn't.
Yes.
They would have advanced their own timely misinterpretations of the situation, but those don't bear any resemblance to what I'm putting forward.
They bear a strong resemblance
in
to
what
me.
way?
Because you're drawing on what has been done as some endorsement of what is done in the future.
Why is the description of the fact that consciousness has been described mythologically as masculine an endorsement of it? The fact that I'm pointing out something exists in the world isn't an endorsement of it, any more than me pointing out that hierarchies exist is an endorsement of it.
But I think you're being a tiny bit disingenuous, because there is a sense of endorsement in the sense that you think we shouldn't struggle against this in our social arrangements. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted Louise O'Neill.
I was really interested there when you said that we can't blame culture for inequality within it. So
that's absolutely the case.
So
inequality is rife in the animal world.
Okay.
Well, so how do you blame that on human culture or the West?
You don't, but why?
Yeah, I mean,
we're
I
not
think
animals.
Yes.
For starters, we're not animals.
Well, I'm not justifying that. I'm saying that, look, there is lots of problems with the fact that there are hierarchies, but the problems with the fact of hierarchies are far deeper than you can use a sociological explanation.
But shouldn't we tackle them? Shouldn't we
I
attempt
never
to tackle
said anything
them rather
about
than,
the utility or lack
rather
thereof
than
of
just
tackling
explaining them or describing them or giving them gendered identities? Wouldn't it be better to actually say?
Well, first of all, we don't give them gendered identities.
How can we enact real social change?
That's a certain perfectly reasonable question.
As I said at the beginning, there's a great deal in the book of Jordan with which I agree with. But let's just deal with this point. I disagree with you, where you talk about functional hierarchies. You say that they're based on competence rather than power. And therefore, actually, that what we shouldn't be looking at when we're looking at functional hierarchies is sort of, we need to move away from victimhood, start working on your competence, and the power structures will be functioning in some way for you. But then I just don't understand and follow that, because how do you then explain so much mediocrity in places where there are so many people who clearly don't have the competence and yet are in positions of power, in positions of authority, in positions in which they're dominating purely by an accident of birth, through the connections and networks that they have. And finally, the bar, for example, my profession as a barrister, is one of those bizarre ironies that when you're in the profession itself, it's probably one of the most meritocratic professions, because once you stand up in front of a judge, you better have the answer. Nobody cares about who your father is. But getting there is the least meritocratic, because actually so much will have to have happened to you in order to get there. But actually being in there, it really is about how good you are, determines how far you go. And so that's an example of functional hierarchies at one end, clearly being dominated by accident of birth and power, but in the other by competence. And to ignore the two is just very simplistic, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Well, I mean, the evolutionary biologists have already established that in human hierarchies there's two routes to success, let's say, power and competence. And degenerate hierarchies use power as the means of establishing.
So you're saying people have corrupted it?
Well, hierarchies in general tilt towards corruption. So that would be the motif of the tyrannical king. It's a very old idea. And one of the things that people have to do as individuals is fight against the fact that tyrannies tend towards corruption. And as they become corrupt, people who use power dominate them. And then they turn into tyrannies. Now, the problem is with terminology like the patriarchy and our general discussion of the patriarchy, we're making the reverse assumption, which is that the fundamental nature of our hierarchical structure is predicated on power and oppression. And I don't believe that that's fundamentally true in the West, even though it is definitely the case, as you pointed out, that every hierarchy is corrupted by power.
Lawrence Wright, you want to come in on this? You write in your book, the danger in holding on to a myth is it becomes like a religion we've stopped believing in. It no longer instructs us, it only stultifies us. That sort of lit up for me after reading your book, because you're very strong on what myths can teach us and how useful they are. There is a danger to them as well, isn't there?
You know, this discussion leads me to think, I've written a lot about terrorism. And I've spent a lot of time in societies that we're not talking about here. We're not talking about the West. We're talking about societies that are profoundly broken. And there's no single cause of terrorism. But it's not like the lack of education. It's not like gender inequality. It's not tyranny. You can isolate each of those and then say that's not the cause of tyranny. But despair is the common element. And in societies where people are frustrated, especially young men, have no route to power at all, then they're given an alternative. And one of those alternatives is you can go kill yourself, and you will make history.
You find salvation in the hereafter.
Yes,
and
right.
You get
Surrender
an identity
here
out of it as well.
And
that's what the high school shooters do.
And you do your suicide video and sort of thing, and you may get a poster on a telephone pole somewhere along the line, and you're remembered. And that is, I think, a concrete example of what we're talking about. Is this, the total feeling of inaccessibility of power, and this is one route terror is to that.
Sorry,
yeah, I was just going to say, we see that in the West as well. In Ireland, 80% of all suicides are by young men. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than by women, and that is, again, I think, an inability to express themselves, because men have not traditionally been given enough space under patriarchal society to be vulnerable, because they see vulnerability or expressing that sort of emotion as being weak, and that's why I think that the rates of mental health issues and suicide are so high amongst young men, particularly in Western societies.
Jordan Peterson, I noticed, I don't think it was it'd be wrong to characterise it as a flinch, but a reaction when Louise was talking. You've written this as well. If men are pushed too hard to feminise, they will become more and more interested in harsh fascist political ideology. That seemed to me an odd thing to say.
It's a standard psychoanalytic idea. It's not a harsh thing to say at all. If you deny people's essential nature, competitive nature, for example,
isn't it
there's
classic
going to be a kickback? And to think of that as enculturated purely is just incorrect.
Yes, but isn't it the classic abuser's exculpation? It's a withdrawal from responsibility. You pushed me to it. You made me hit you.
It's not a justification. It's just an observation of what's likely. If you push people too far in a particular direction, it's a warning, not a justification.
But the solution to that is not to worry about feminising men. It's perhaps to worry about men joining fascist organisations.
No, I think it's to worry about the sorts of things that Lawrence already talked about, and the probability that steep, unequal hierarchies will produce desperate young men. And that's actually a critique of hierarchy, by the way.
Louise O'Neill.
Yeah, I have 2 points there. I suppose the first one is that when you talk about, feminizing men, it almost sounds derogatory. It's almost as if you're saying that to be feminine or to express any sort of femininity is actually inferior to masculinity. And I think that is a huge problem, even within the language that we use. When you say, don't be such a girl, don't be such a pussy, the greatest insults that men can give each other tend to have feminine origins, like, as I said, pussy or faggot, or anything like that. And I think, again, that speaks to a very systematic inequality between the genders. And
you attributed the rates of mental illness among men to their inability to express, say, sentimental emotions.
Well,
and I don't think there's a shred of clinical evidence to support that stance.
Sorry.
No. Well, I don't think there's a shred of evidence to support that stance. The kind of violence, for example, that Lawrence is discussing is a consequence of competitive competitive violence among young men as
I think
they
there is some evidence that men find it difficult to talk about things, and that
and they also
ways
find
in
it
which
hard
you can
to
help
reach
young
out.
men to talk about things.
And that's the evidence for the differential rates of mental health
And
suffering?
I also don't think when you're talking about things being so innate, Judith Butler would have said that, gender is a construct, that gender is a performance.
Well, Judith Butler doesn't know what she's talking about in the least, so I don't accept that.
That's interesting, but
she's no scientist. She doesn't know the psychological literature. Well, then if you look at someone like Cordelia Fine, who wrote The Delusions of Gender.
Haji Mohammed.
I was just going to ask. Sorry, do you want to finish your sentence?
No.
I was just going to ask about the one of the things Jordan says about order and chaos is between order and chaos you go on to find some sort of meaning, and I just wanted to pursue that with you because one of the things I found coming here as a young boy with very little order as such and much chaos, it was of great importance to try and find a way in which you could sort of have some impact of your life. And this is not a new idea, though, because I don't know if you've read much of Viktor Frankl's work in the Pursuit of Meaning, in which he talks about to live is to suffer, but to survive is to find meaning in that suffering. But I just wanted to take it one step further, where you say, actually, therefore, the pursuit of happiness is something that you shouldn't bother with. And actually, the real pursuit of life is about meaning. Whereas Viktor Frankl, for example, says you do not necessarily have to suffer to find that meaning. There are other ways in which you can find that meaning.
No, I don't think you have to suffer to find the meaning, but you need the meaning to be able to tolerate your suffering.
Right. Okay. So it's about finding the meaning in order to be able to survive your circumstances and not necessarily...
Without becoming bitter. That's exactly right.
Louise, I want to come on to you because you've written a book about suffering. I mean, it is mostly about a woman's suffering. Why did you want to rewrite this particular tale?
Well, I suppose I was really fascinated by the story as a child. The Disney version came out in 1989. I was 4 years of age, and I think it was the first Disney princess in 30 years, and she sort of imprinted herself onto the psyche of an entire generation of young women. But it was as a teenager, I think, when I began to identify as a feminist, that I started to look at that story and other fairy tales as well through a more critical lens, I suppose, and I could see aspects of it that I found deeply problematic. And I suppose for me, I began to suffer with anorexia at the age of 15, and I had kind of oscillated between anorexia and bulimia for most of my teenage years and well into my 20s. And I started to wonder about the social messaging, contained within stories like these fairy tales, where it was that you have to change your physical appearance in order that a man will love you. And the idea of, I suppose, attaining that sometimes unattainable ideal of beauty in order to win that love, I suppose I just find that really dark messaging, especially to be telling young children.
One has to say it's a dark ending to your. You haven't replaced it with as it were, a positive and light.
Well, I thought it was much more empowering, actually. But it's funny. I think that in life I tend to be a bit of a Pollyanna, but sometimes when I sit down to write, I think all of the darkness comes out, and a lot of that is just experience just as a woman living in the world. It's hard not to feel that.
One of the things I thought was interesting about your retelling of it was that it does unleash a sense of revenge. It doesn't shy away from vengeance. One of your characters say, "I will flay the skin from the bones of men like my father. Well, I will tear them apart and I will eat them raw."
Jordan's going to kill me. I'm so scared. Please help me.
Well, he may have things to say about it.
Yeah, well, it was when I was doing research, I came across the Rusalka, which is in Slavic mythology, and it is young women who died in very tragic circumstances. So maybe they were jilted at the altar, or they were drowned because they became pregnant with an unwanted child. And for me, I suppose, growing up in Ireland, a country in which the church and the state conspired for so long to police women's sexualities and bodies, I saw some parallels between that, and that's between the Magdalens, the women who were basically enslaved in the Magdalen laundries, and in the mother and baby homes. And I suppose in Ireland, coming up to the referendum at the end of this month,
the referendum on the 8th,
to legalise abortion in this country, it felt like a moment, I suppose, of an attempt to make reparations to the women of the past. So maybe that's a better way of putting it than revenge.
Jordan Peterson, you can't object to that entirely, because your book writes specifically about revenge and a sense of vengeance, and the moments at which it is reasonable to release that.
Well, it's not that easy to discriminate between the desire for revenge and the desire for justice. It's a very tight and fine line to draw. And so, obviously justice is something worth pursuing, but I suppose justice is minimal necessary force to put things right, and revenge is taking it farther than that. And it risks spiraling out of control, which it tends to do.
But it's reasonable, isn't it, for women who find themselves in a position that they regard as unjust to take kind of quite strong actions?
Oh, I've never said anything in the book that would ask people not to stop transforming societies in a positive direction. Like I said, the fact that I describe the existence of hierarchies outside the human realm and point out that you can't attribute the existence of hierarchies to any particular political system doesn't mean that I justify the facts of their existence or am ignorant about their shortcomings.
You do write about revenge like this, though. You say at one point in the book, when should you start pushing back against oppression despite the danger? When you start nursing secret fantasies of revenge, when your life is being poisoned and your imagination fills with the wish to devour and destroy. I was struck by that because it seems to take symptoms of an individual disorder, a paranoia, really, something quite dangerous, and endorse it as a description of the world at large.
No, it just points out that when you walk home from work and you're thinking about violent things in relationship to your boss, that you probably have something to say that you should have said a long time ago. And you have to pay attention to those dark fantasies that build at the back of your imagination, because they tell you when you're not being courageous enough in your life and are building up the kind of resentment that could explode outward and destroy things. It's no justification for it. It's an observation again.
I'm going to turn to Hashim Mohammed here. I'm curious to know, because your early education, you lived with a family, you know, your family is Somali refugees, going to state schools, not very good state schools, living on benefits. You didn't do terribly well at school. Was it resentment that finally made you turn the corner, or was it something else? What was the sparking seed that made you decide?
It's something that I'm currently interrogating in my own mind. But one thing I do recall most growing up in those circumstances, especially when, as a 9-year-old boy, burying your father and coming to a new country, trying to understand a new setting, a new way of life, a new culture, without your parents, without anybody explaining precisely why what's happening is actually happening. But what I do remember vividly is there was never any real resentment. There was always just confusion and chaos, but there was never really resentment, because we just felt that things were happening to us. We didn't have much control over what was going on. And so it was sort of 10 years during which you're going from pillar to post and not trying to understand. My mother would join us 4 years later, but it was just that constant confusion. And it was only when I went back to Kenya to kind of reconcile the past with the present, to try and understand what the messages some people were giving us in terms of what we had left behind and the reality that I discovered when I got there, when it didn't match up. It's a common refugee story. When you arrive in a country, you're often told, well, we're going to go back. It's only temporary. You hear that from everyone, right, who's a refugee. It's always the case that you hold on to something that was probably a myth. And so only when I went back as a sort of 18, 19-year-old, when I actually saw what I had come from, when I saw where I had spent those years, and then just sort of the pin dropped, realizing actually that I don't think I'm coming back to this. And it was at that moment that sort of the mist kind of lifts, and you think to yourself, okay, now I understand. Now, finally, I can actually concentrate on making something of myself, and I find myself to be where I am now.
What's interesting, though, is that the Somali community is in trouble at the moment. It is a sort of beleaguered refugee community in this country, and not everybody makes that choice.
Yes,
some go to crime, some go to.
I've got many
drugs.
Siblings who've ended up in prison. I've got siblings who've had issues with mental health. And I mean, that journey of mine is not necessarily a common one. That's quite right.
So how did you do it? How did you manage to avoid being resentful and taking a path that would lead you down instead of up?
I genuinely could not answer that without sort of being disingenuous looking back. I don't think there was any conscious decision about that. What I do recall fundamentally, for example, is that we were raised by women, because most of the men had either perished in the war or, my father died in a car crash. And so one of the things that my auntie, my grandmother, my mother often made was they just kept us busy. And one of the ways they just kept us busy was you went to school, you came back, you went to play football, you basketball, bicycle. Every waking hour that we had was occupied with some form of activity, which meant that we didn't have time to hang out in the streets. We didn't have time to be idle. We didn't have time to do anything else but just be physically and mentally healthy.
Now, as people can hear, you obviously did not decide the world is going to take me as I am. You adapted. You
Yes.
described social adaptation as a chameleon-like trick. One of the questions I want to ask you is this the authentic you, or is there a set of authentic yous?
Well,
you choose which is
Yes, I mean,
useful for which occasion?
English is my third language, if you can believe it. I was born in Kenya to Somali parents, and Swahili was my first language. Then I spoke Somali and then English. But for me, I'm not the same person as I was as the 9-year-old boy who arrived here with very little English, to the 15-year-old boy who barely passed GCSE English, to the 32-year-old who's broadcasting on Radio 4 as I did with my documentary. But we change, we grow. The idea that humans are static and sort of this one person throughout your life is one of the biggest falsehoods that we sell people, and that's something that I'm constantly talking about. And similarly, when I speak to my mother or other elder persons in my family, we speak in Somali, which is my mother tongue. But I could be talking to my young cousins in street slang, but then I could be in court saying my lord and my lady. But the idea that somehow I'm not being authentic in one setting or the other is just poisonous.
Yeah.
And
it is poisonous. You wrote something interesting recently. You said about social mobility. You said sometimes increasing social mobility means not expecting your employee to look, sound, and as if they attend the same club as you.
Yes.
But
Yes.
clearly you do.
Yes.
You do look and sound as if you attend the same club. So you've made a decision to do that.
I do, but then again, I did go to Oxford University for a period
So
of
the
time.
process had
and I
started
did work
earlier.
at the BBC for some time, and I am a member of the Bar of England and Wales. So this was the natural
I
progression.
suppose my question is: would the chambers in the Inns of Court be better if, as it were, there were more people who listened to grime rather than opera?
Undoubtedly.
So how do you make that happen?
Undoubtedly, if we had a legal profession in which how you sounded did not matter, it would be ideal. But then there's a difference between the world as I would like it to be and the world as I find it. The world as I find it is an English and British culture that is completely and utterly obsessed with how people speak, and quite frankly, whether you are heard depends on what you're saying, but also how you're saying it. And so if that penny has dropped for you, it seems to me that you've got a choice to make. Either you figure out the way in which you're going to adapt and become more effective at communicating, or stick to some ideals that won't come to fruition for centuries, if not a lot longer than that, long after you're gone.
Do you seek out pupils now that you're in a position to do it from
All the time,
Yeah.
all the time. I try my best to find more people, because again, as Jordan was saying, in an ideal world, it should be about competence, not nothing else. But in reality, it's not just about competence,
Yeah.
frankly.
And I think that's
Lauren's right. It's so germane to what you've written about as well. That sort of this Texan notion: we are not going to change ourselves to fit what America thinks should be right. They're sort of fiercely loyal to a certain notion of a way of speaking, a way of being, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think it ties into this general conversation with the question of resentment. Growing up in Texas, I felt resentful of the Eastern establishment. But this resentment is a powerful force in, I think, all of our societies. And I think Donald Trump is a perfect expression of the resentment that so many people in America felt towards the mainstream political establishment. He is an expression of it. And the resentment against the West. All of these are built on the idea that they have something that we don't have, and that we're being kept from it. And as long as you have a society, in Texas is very, still has this sense that the government, the federal government, is the problem. It's the outsiders. It's not exclusive to Texas. There are lots of people in America and all over the West that feel resentment against outside authorities. But I think it's the sense that there is a club. And, you talk about joining the club. And I joined the club, too, but there's still a sense that I don't belong. That, I'm in...
You mean in New York, in a journalistic world in New York? Yeah.
Right. Like when my editor asked me to explain Texas, it was like, it called into question, my credentials.
One of the threads of your book is that if we look at Texas and understand Texas, we understand to a degree where America is going.
Yeah.
Is that a baleful prospect or a...
It's to some extent, yeah. I mean, Texas has 29 million people now, and it's expected to double by 2050, at which time it will be about the size of California and New York combined. And its economy is growing, the fourth quarter of 2017 at 5.2%. The only other state that even got 4% was Idaho, and I don't know what accounts for that—a burst in potatoes, I suppose. But it's outstripping all the other states, and so there's a great deal to be learned and appreciated about the model that Texas has created. Is adoration of entrepreneurialism and free enterprise and so on. And the downside of that is rather heartless social policies.
I get more downside from your book than upside. I mean, you write that Dallas is a far better city because Kennedy died there. You write at one point, now I look out at the country and wonder if America is turning into Dallas 1963. What did you mean by that?
Well, I grew up in Dallas and was there when Kennedy was killed. It was a city where the politics were running off the rails. Speaking of the politics of resentment, it was perfectly expressed in Dallas then. And that's why people accused Dallas of killing Kennedy, which was absurd. He was killed by a Marxist. Well, I didn't know we had Marxists in Dallas. I scarcely knew any Democrats. But it was riding high. It was so cocksure of itself. And then came the assassination and the humiliation that followed. To be from Dallas after that, it was a tremendous stigma. And some cities would behave differently, I'm sure. No other city in America was ever taken down the way that Dallas was. But there is some sort of kinship between humiliation and humility. And Dallas went through that process. And I was there during the time when the police were killed. And the way that the city reacted to that was so noble. And so vulnerable. I think it is transformed itself into a far different culture. And the reason I said that if Kennedy had to die somewhere, I'm glad he died in Dallas, because Dallas took the opportunity to use that tragedy to become a better place to live.
One of the common themes here is anger. I mean, it's expressed a lot in what you write about Texas politics now. Yeah. Fierce culture wars over the gendering of bathrooms. Who will be allowed to go into a bathroom? Is it that rage you think is something that is increasing across the country at large?
Oh yeah,
that sense
I think
of
so.
rage.
Although when we talk about the bathroom bill, which was, thank goodness, not enacted in this previous session that I covered, but may well be the next time. But Texas is thought of as being a very macho state, but the most popular figure in the whole state is Willie Nelson, who is a very transgressive figure. I mean, he came to Texas. He grew up in Texas, but he came back to Texas with long hair at a time when they put it in pigtails, man in pigtails. And this was, you were really asking for it in Texas. He's beloved even by people who strongly disagree with him, like Ted Cruz. And, Willie is a Bernie Sanders acolyte, but, he's a proponent of marijuana legalization. But if there's one single figure that is a unifying figure in the state, Willie is the guy.
That's Texan by other means, though, isn't it? Take me as I am. I'm not going to change a damn thing for your convenience.
He certainly expresses an ethos of Texas that I think is often not appreciated outside of the state.
Jordan Peterson, I wanted to quickly, before we run out of time, ask you, do you worry about any of your followers? You have very large numbers on YouTube. And
I worry about all my followers. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm trying to help people lead better individual lives.
I wonder if you know what I'm asking. I'm wondering whether you worry the more extreme of them.
Well, I don't think that there's any grounds for asking that. I think people have made an assumption that there's a disproportionate number of extremists among my followers. I don't think there's a shred of evidence for that. I think that it's extraordinarily...
You protest quite a lot. You use this phrase that I don't think there's a shred of evidence. Of course, I can't supply the evidence right now. But It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And your that particular framing.
What's the evidence that it does exist?
Let me say this to Jordan. I mean, the idea that Jordan's followers are all angry white men, it's just not true.
No, I know.
But equally, do you not accept that there are a lot of people who have associated with your movement and your messages with whom I, for example, find representable?
You can answer that quickly because we're running out of time. But
well, I think that
seconds.
Because I've taken a stand against the radical left, that it's been convenient for an assortment of equally reprehensible right-wingers to assume that I'm one of theirs, but I'm not, and I've made many public statements stating that I'm an absolute opponent of identity politics, whether it's played on the left or on the right.
Okay, you've said it again. Thank you very much, and thank you to all my guests. I knew we would run out of time. Lawrence Wright's God Save Texas, Louise O'Neill's The Surface Breaks, a reimagining of The Little Mermaid, and Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life are all out now. You can still hear Hashi Mohammed's documentary, Adventures in Social Mobility, on the Radio 4 website. It's excellent. Next week, Amal Rajan is here. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.